Welcome back to Plain Sight Dogs. Tonight, we dive into a chilling mystery from Vermont's wilderness. We're not searching for a killer, but for why people vanish in these dark, remote woods. Vermont may look like a postcard with its rolling hills and covered bridges, but beneath the surface lies an ancient, untamed land. The Green Mountains are vast and isolated, places where the forest floor never sees sunlight. A land of violent weather and deep woods, where civilization is mere feet from total isolation. Legends warn of a cursed area here, a place people instinctively avoid, especially near Glastonbury Mountain and the Bennington Triangle. Named in the 1940s, this vast wilderness saw a chilling series of disappearances between 1945 and 1950. People vanished without a trace, leaving behind only footprints that stopped abruptly. No bodies, no struggle, no answers. Tonight, we explore 5 of these disappearances. From an experienced woodsman to a young child, all vanished in a mysterious void. No forensic evidence, just fear. We'll investigate strange details linking these events. Search dogs baffled by severed scent trails, sudden violent weather, and a dread that gripped everyone who ventured too close. This isn't just a missing person case. This is the mystery of Bennington's cursed mountain. Make sure to subscribe and hit that bell. Don't miss out on our next uploads. Let's begin with our story today. The string of disappearances that would define the Bennington Triangle did not begin with a careless tourist. It began with the impossible vanishing of a man who knew the mountain better than any person alive. His name was Middie Rivers. He was 74 years old. This was November 12, 1945. Middie Rivers was not a hobbyist. He was a seasoned professional hunting and fishing guide. He had spent his entire life in the shadow of Glastonbury Mountain, walking its trails, reading its weather, and understanding its secret paths. He was described by locals as being part of the woods, a man more comfortable in the dense forest than in a warm home. He was the last person on Earth who should have gotten lost. On that cold November afternoon, Rivers was leading a small group of 4 hunters up the mountain. The air was frigid, the ground damp. The sky was a low, gray, oppressive ceiling. The group was hiking along a familiar trail one Rivers had walked hundreds of times before. They were moving single file, with Rivers as the guide in the lead. As they approached their campsite, Rivers got slightly ahead of the group. He was a fast walker for his age, confident in his steps. The other hunters reported that he walked around a bend in the trail just a few dozen yards in front of them, and out of their sight for only a few moments. They heard the crunch of his footsteps on the leaves, and then they heard nothing. When the rest of the party rounded that same bend, Middie Rivers was gone. There was no sound, no cry for help, no gunshot, no sign of a struggle with an animal. He had simply and completely vanished into the cold, silent woods. The hunters, confused, but not yet panicked, called out his name. They trusted Middie. They figured he had seen a deer track and stepped off the path to investigate, as he had done 100 times before. But the only reply was the sound of the wind, cold and indifferent. They fired their rifles into the air, the universal signal for a lost hunter. The shots echoed flat and dead against the dense trees. There was no response. The group searched the immediate area, their confusion slowly turning to a cold, sharp dread. The ground was damp and soft, perfect for leaving tracks. They could see their own footprints clearly. But the trail left by Middie Rivers, a man they had been following seconds before, simply stopped. It did not turn off the path. It did not show signs of a scuffle. It just ended as if he had been lifted clean out of the world. It was a physical impossibility. They searched the shallow creek bed he had just crossed. The only thing they found was a single, unused rifle cartridge near the water. A cartridge that had apparently fallen from Middie's pocket. It was the only trace of him left on Earth. The small party searched until the light failed, that early suffocating dusk that falls in the mountains. The oppressive total darkness of the mountain night descended, forcing them back to their camp. They were now alone, their expert guide erased by the wilderness. The four hunters spent a terrified, sleepless night at their camp. The familiar quiet woods had transformed into a place of deep menace. Every crackle of a branch, every hoot of an owl sounded like a threat. Their guide, the one man who understood this dark territory, was gone, erased in the span of a few seconds. At the first hint of gray dawn, they abandoned their hunt and made the long, anxious hike back down the mountain to the town of Bennington to alert the authorities. The initial response was one of disbelief. Middie Rivers was a local legend. The idea of him getting lost was absurd, like a fish drowning in water. But the panic in the hunters' eyes was real. A search party was formed immediately, a small army of local volunteers, police, and experienced woodsmen who knew Middie personally. They were confident they would find him by nightfall, likely injured or disoriented. They returned to the spot where the hunters had last seen him. The search began. The men fanned out, combing the dense, cold forest. They searched every hollow log, every ravine, every thicket of trees. They found nothing. The woods were unnervingly still. Then the search dogs were brought in. This was the moment everyone expected a breakthrough. The dogs were given Middie's scent from the cartridge found by the creek. The hounds picked up the trail instantly, baying with confidence as they followed his path. They followed the trail along the creek bed exactly where the hunter said he had walked. And then, in the middle of an open, clear patch of ground, the dogs stopped. They did not just lose the trail. They stopped dead, sniffing the empty air, whining in confusion. They circled the area trying to find the scent again, but it was gone. It was as if Middie Rivers had simply been lifted off the ground, the very molecules of his scent erased from the earth. This was the first time investigators would encounter this phenomenon in the Bennington Triangle, but it would not be the last. The trail was severed. The search grew more frantic. More men were called in. They searched for days and then weeks. The Vermont State Police became involved, expanding the grid search for miles in every direction. They found not a single broken twig, not another footprint, not one shred of his clothing. Middie Rivers, the 74-year-old expert of the woods, had vanished within sight of his companions, leaving behind only a single bullet and a scent trail that led to nowhere. The mountain had swallowed him whole, leaving the searchers with a cold, terrifying, and impossible truth. The wilderness had taken him, and it was not giving him back. The vanishing of Middie Rivers in 1945 sent a cold ripple of fear through the small, tight-knit communities around Glastonbury Mountain. Locals, who had long respected the woods, now began to truly fear them. They whispered old stories of the cursed land and the man-eating stone. But because Rivers was 74, some rationalized the event. Perhaps he had a heart attack and collapsed. Or perhaps, despite his experience, he had simply wandered off and succumbed to the cold. The event was largely seen as a tragic, if baffling, local anomaly. Then just 13 months later, the mountain took someone else. This time, the victim was not an elderly woodsman. She was the exact opposite, a young, vibrant, inexperienced college student. Her disappearance would drag the dark secret of the Bennington Triangle out of the local woods and onto the front pages of newspapers across the nation. Her name was Paula Jean Welden. She was 18 years old, a sophomore at Bennington College, the place known for its free, spirited, and intellectual students. On December 1st, 1946, Paula finished her shift at the college dining hall. She was reportedly in good spirits, telling her roommate, Elizabeth Johnson, that she was going for a long walk. It was a cold, gray afternoon, with the sun already low in the sky. It was not yet snowing, but the air was heavy with the threat of it. She was wearing a distinctive bright red parka. This detail is crucial. In the muted gray-brown landscape of a Vermont winter, a bright red parka should have been a beacon. It is a color that is impossible to miss, a color that should have made her an easy target for any search party. Paula walked from the campus and hitchhiked a ride from a local man named Louis Knapp. He drove her a few miles, dropping her near the entrance to the Long Trail, a famous 272-mile rugged hiking path that cuts through the Green Mountains. Knapp confirmed she seemed normal and happy, just a student looking for an afternoon hike. She was not equipped for a serious trek. She had no overnight bag, no extra food, no heavy gear. She was just a girl in a red coat walking into the woods as the light began to fail. Paula was last seen by several witnesses on the trail itself. A group of hikers remembered passing her. She was walking alone, moving quickly. An elderly couple who were walking just behind her saw her round a bend in the path, heading up the trail. They noted her red parka and thought nothing of it. Just like Middie Rivers, she walked around a bend in the trail and was never seen again. When she failed to return to her dorm room that night, her roommate grew concerned. Paula was a responsible student. Disappearing without a word was not in her character. By the next morning, the college was in a full-blown panic. Paula Welden was gone. The authorities were called immediately. This time, the response would be massive. The disappearance of a young, promising college student, the daughter of a prominent Connecticut industrialist, triggered a search that would dwarf the one for Middie Rivers. The Vermont State Police, hundreds of college students from Bennington and Williams College, local volunteers, and eventually the National Guard descended on the Long Trail. The hunt had begun, but they were searching for a girl in a red parka who had vanished into thin air. The search for Paula Jean Welden was immediate, frantic, and massive. This was not like the quiet local effort for Middie Rivers. This was different. This was a wealthy 18-year-old student from a prominent Connecticut family. Her father, William Welden, was an influential industrialist. He arrived in Bennington and applied intense, immediate pressure on the local authorities. He demanded answers. He demanded resources. The small local sheriff's department was overwhelmed, unequipped for a mystery of this scale. A desperate army descended on the Long Trail. Hundreds of searchers, students from Bennington College and nearby Williams College, local police, firefighters, and soon the Vermont National Guard. They fanned out into the dark, frozen woods, a human net dragged across the mountain. They were searching for that single splash of color in a gray, desolate landscape. They were searching for the red parka, but the mountain held its silence. The searchers found nothing. No scraps of red fabric, no discarded wrappers, not a single sign that she had ever been there aside from the initial witness reports. The mountain, it seemed, was actively resisting them. The weather, which had been clear when Paula started her hike, turned volatile. A freezing fog descended, followed by snow. The search parties were operating in near-zero visibility, their hands numb, their calls swallowed by the thick, damp air. The cold was a physical enemy, sharp and brutal, draining the hope from the men. Every hour that passed made the search more desperate. Every empty ravine and silent grove deepened the dread. The red parka, which should have been a beacon, was nowhere to be seen. It was as if the forest had muted her, pulling her color into its own gray emptiness. Then, just as they had in the Middie Rivers case, the search dogs were brought in. This was the moment everyone expected a breakthrough. The hounds were given Paula's scent from her dorm room. They picked up her trail easily at the start of the Long Trail. They followed her path, matching the witness statements, leading the searchers up the mountain. And then, at a specific point on the trail, a rocky outcropping near a place called Faye's Corner, the dogs stopped. They did not just lose the scent. The scent did not fade. It simply and impossibly ended. The dogs sniffed the cold rocks, the empty air, and whined in confusion. They could not find a single trace of where she had gone. It was the exact same phenomenon that had baffled searchers 13 months earlier. Her trail was severed. The forensic void had opened again. Deprived of a physical trail, the entire investigation began to fracture. The massive search became a chaotic, uncoordinated failure. William Welden, furious, publicly criticized the local sheriff's handling of the case. He pointed out the total lack of professional centralized command. This massive high-profile failure exposed a shocking vulnerability. In 1946, the state of Vermont did not have a state police force. The disappearance of Paula Jean Welden and the resulting chaos of the failed search was the catalyst that forced the Vermont legislature to create the Vermont State Police the following year. The Bennington Triangle had already claimed 2 victims, and in doing so, had forced the creation of the very agency that would hunt for its future victims. With the trail dead and the woods empty, the searchers had nowhere left to look. The mystery turned away from the mountain and toward Paula herself. With the mountain search a frozen, desolate failure, investigators had no choice. They turned away from the empty woods and began to dig into the one thing they had left, Paula's life. If the trail on the mountain was a void, perhaps the trail in her past would lead them somewhere. The media frenzy was now in full force. Paula Welden was no longer just a missing person, she was a national story. Reporters from Boston, New York, and Hartford descended on Bennington, hungry for any detail. This intense pressure, combined with the lack of any physical evidence, pushed the investigation into a dark and desperate phase. Theories began to splinter. Was she a victim of the mountain, or had she orchestrated her own disappearance? Investigators interviewed her roommate Elizabeth Johnson again. This time, small troubling details emerged. Paula had not been in the good spirits everyone claimed. In the days before she vanished, she had seemed melancholy and distressed. She had reportedly been upset over a disagreement with her parents. This single detail cracked the case wide open, but in the wrong direction. Suddenly, Paula was not a victim. She was a runaway. The theory took root. Paula, an unhappy 18-year-old, had simply walked away from her life. She had staged the hike, hitchhiked out of town, and was now starting a new life somewhere else. Her father, William Welden, was enraged by this. He insisted his daughter was a stable, responsible girl who would never do such a thing. But the police, left with no other leads, pursued it. They sent out alerts across the country, checked bus depots, and followed dozens of false sightings. The media in turn began to paint a picture of a troubled, mysterious girl, not the happy sophomore she was known as. The runaway theory, however, did not fit the facts. She had taken no money. She had packed no extra clothes. Her bank account was untouched. She had left all her belongings in her dorm room, as if she fully intended to return that evening. It was the profile of a person going for a short walk, not someone escaping their life. But the police were desperate. They had to find a suspect, human or otherwise. The investigation began to look at the people who last saw her. They re-questioned Louis Knapp, the driver who gave her a ride. They re-questioned the elderly couple on the trail. All of them were quickly cleared. There was no person of interest. Then a darker theory emerged, one whispered by locals: a serial killer. The long trail was isolated. A predator could have been waiting in the woods, attacked her, and used the dense, rugged wilderness as a perfect, untraceable dumping ground. This theory at least felt rational. It felt human. It was a dark comfort compared to the alternative that the land itself was responsible. But if it was a killer, he was a ghost. He left no signs of a struggle, no blood, no tracks. And he had somehow silenced the highly trained bloodhounds. The investigation was turning in circles. Every lead, whether it pointed to Paula herself or to a phantom attacker, led back to the same impossible silence. The case was no longer just a search, it was a media circus and a bureaucratic nightmare. The Bennington Triangle had claimed its most famous victim, and in doing so, had exposed the total failure of the systems meant to protect people from the dark. But days turned into weeks, and weeks turned into a cold, bleak winter. The search was finally officially called off. The hundreds of volunteers and National Guardsmen went home. The college students returned to their classes, their dorms, walking past Paula's empty room every day. The snow on Glastonbury Mountain grew deep, covering the long trail, burying any faint hope that a clue might have been missed. The case was not solved. It simply stopped, frozen in time. The media circus eventually packed up and left. The national spotlight turned away, leaving the town of Bennington alone with its new dark legend. Paula Jean Welden. The girl in the bright red parka was gone. She had been erased from the world as completely as Middie Rivers. With no evidence, no suspect, and no body, the official investigation stalled, becoming a cold case. But the questions remained festering in the local community. Left without any rational explanation, the old dark whispers about the mountain returned louder this time. People began to talk less about runaways or killers, and more about the land itself. They remembered the Native American legends that cursed ground the man-eating stone. They spoke of the woods as a place that did not just hide dangers, but was itself a danger. This was not just idle gossip. The facts defied logic. How does a person followed by witnesses simply disappear from a trail? How does a scent trail, followed by trained hounds, sever itself in the middle of an open path? These were not normal occurrences. They felt to many like something supernatural. Theories once whispered were now discussed openly. Had she fallen into a hidden crevice, an old forgotten well from the ghost town of Glastonbury? Searchers had checked everyone they could find. Had she stumbled into a thin place, a spot where the barrier between worlds was weak as the old legends claimed? The disappearance resonated deeply. A dark stone dropped into the cultural pond. The author Shirley Jackson, who was living in North Bennington at the time, was haunted by the case. The unsettling void left by Paula's disappearance became a dark seed of inspiration for her 1951 novel Hangzima. The event had transcended a simple missing persons case. It had become a piece of dark modern folklore, a true Gothic horror story. The failure to find Paula Welden was total. It was a complete and utter defeat for law enforcement, for logic, and for the families who just wanted an answer. The mountain had taken her, and it had not left so much as a thread of her red parka behind. The void had won. The Bennington Triangle now had its most famous victim, and the period of its darkest activity was only just beginning. The fear was no longer just a suspicion. It was a proven fact. People who walked on that mountain were not safe. And for the next 3 years, the mountain would remain quiet, as if digesting its terrible secret before it struck again. As the official search collapsed, the investigation grew desperate. With no physical clues, police turned to the only thing they had left: human suspects. The void on the mountain created a vacuum that was quickly filled by suspicion and dark rumors. The media, lacking any real updates, began to focus on any person of interest, no matter how thin the connection. The investigation, led by the out-of-his-depth county sheriff, began to focus on a local lumberjack named Fred Gaudet. Gaudet lived in a shack on Harbor Road, the very path Paula had walked. He was one of the last people to have seen her. On the day Paula vanished, Gaudet had been in a loud, violent argument with his girlfriend. Some witnesses claimed to have seen him just after Paula passed by. He was a perfect suspect, a rough, isolated man who lived in the woods. But when police questioned him, his story was confusing and contradictory. He lied about his movements. Then, under pressure, he changed his story. This was all the police needed. They began to focus on him intensely. But they had no evidence. No body, no weapon, no confession. Gaudet was a convenient scapegoat, a target for the media and the frustrated police. But nothing connected him to the crime. Then, a darker, more disturbing rumor surfaced. It was said that Gaudet, in a drunken argument, had boasted to at least 2 people that he knew where Paula Welden was buried. He claimed he knew the location of her body but would never tell. When confronted by police, he dismissed it as a cruel, drunken boast, the words of a man trying to feel important. The police had nothing to hold him on. They couldn't prove he was lying, and they couldn't prove he was telling the truth. He was just another dead end, another shadow in the woods. The investigation also turned on Paula's father, William Welden. In his grief and rage, he had been intensely critical of the local police, calling them incompetent. He hired his own private investigators, offered a massive $5,000 reward, and even consulted a psychic from New Hampshire. This psychic claimed Paula was in a dazed state, being held in a gray house not far from the trail. This sent searchers on another frantic, useless chase, checking every gray building in the county. The sheriff, angered by Welden's public criticism, began to push back. He suggested that William Welden himself was not being truthful. He hinted that the family knew more than they were saying about Paula's unhappiness. In a matter of weeks, the investigation had dissolved into a bitter public feud between the victim's father and the chief investigator. The search for Paula was lost in a fog of accusation and incompetence. The entire case was a catastrophic failure, a perfect example of a botched investigation. The lack of a professional statewide police force had allowed the crucial first days of the search to descend into chaos, and now that chaos had consumed the case itself. The Bennington Triangle wasn't just swallowing people, it was swallowing the truth. The public feud between Paula's father and the local sheriff was the final nail in the coffin of the investigation. The case was no longer a unified search for a missing girl. It was a fractured, bitter war of egos. The sheriff, defensive and embarrassed, had no more leads to follow. William Welden, heartbroken and furious, eventually returned to Connecticut, leaving behind the reward money and a cloud of unresolved anger. The case was left in the hands of authorities who had already proven they were incapable of solving it. The private investigators he hired found nothing. The psychic's visions led to empty barns and cold, dark, silent basements. Every single avenue had been explored, and every one of them ended at a wall of silence. The investigation, for all its noise and media attention, had produced zero facts. Other, more desperate theories were floated. Some suggested Paula had a secret lover, a man she had planned to meet on the trail. They claimed she had run away to be with him. But this theory never held weight. Friends and family insisted she had no such secret relationship. And again, the evidence did not fit. She took no money, no luggage. It was a romantic fantasy invented by people who needed a human reason for her disappearance. Others clung to the accident theory. He had slipped, fallen into a deep, undiscovered ravine, and was buried by the snow. This was plausible, even likely, in any other part of the world. But this was Glastonbury. The search had been massive. Hundreds of men had combed that area. They had looked in the ravines. They had probed the snow, to find nothing, not a scrap of red cloth, not a boot, not a bone, stretched the idea of a simple accident to its breaking point. And so, all rational explanations failed. All that was left was the impossible truth. A girl had walked up a trail in broad daylight. She was seen by witnesses. She was followed by witnesses. And in the space of a few hundred yards, she had ceased to exist. Her scent trail, the physical proof of her passing, had been severed from the earth, as if by a knife. The dogs could not follow her because, according to the dogs, she was no longer there. This was the fact that investigators could not face, the one that the media could not explain. This was the anti-forensic story. This was the void. The disappearance of Paula Jean Welden changed Vermont. It led directly to the creation of the Vermont State Police in July 1947, a force born from the ashes of this one catastrophic failure. But it was too late for Paula. Her case went cold, filed away in a cabinet, a permanent record of incompetence and mystery. The red parka was never found. The girl who walked away never came back. For 3 years, the Bennington Triangle was quiet. The disappearances stopped. The fear subsided, but it never left. It lingered in the towns, a shared dark memory. The mountain was still there, silent, watching. And in once 949, it would prove that it was not finished. For 3 years, the mountain was quiet. The Paula Welden case grew cold, a permanent file of failure and incompetence. The fear in Bennington subsided, but it never left. It became a dark, shared memory. Then, in 1949, the void opened again. This time, it did not happen on a remote, lonely trail. It happened in a place that should have been safe, a place sealed against the wilderness. It happened on a moving bus. The date was December 1st, 1949. It was exactly 3 years to the day since Paula Welden had walked into the woods and never returned. The chilling coincidence was lost on investigators at the time. The new victim was James E. Tedford. Tedford was a 68-year-old veteran returning to his residence at the Soldiers' Home in Bennington. He had been in St. Albans, Vermont, visiting relatives. His trip home was long but perfectly routine. His family saw him safely onto the bus. It was a local bus making its winding journey south. This was not a hike. It was the most ordinary form of travel. 14 other passengers were on board. They were quiet, looking out the windows as the bus moved through the deep, cold night of the Green Mountains. The bus was a self-contained world, a small bubble of light and warmth. James Tedford was seen by these passengers. He was sitting in his seat, his head resting against the window. Some reported he was asleep. His luggage was stored on the rack above his head. His destination was the final stop, Bennington. The bus made several scheduled stops, but Tedford never got off. Witnesses confirmed he was still on the bus as it entered the last long stretch of highway, the same dark corridor of wilderness that defined the Bennington Triangle. This is where the case moves from a simple mystery to a logical impossibility. This is the locked room on wheels. The bus was moving. It did not make any unscheduled stops. The driver was at the wheel. The other passengers were present. The windows were sealed against the bitter December cold. There was no way out. Yet when the bus pulled into the Bennington station, James Tedford was gone. Not just missing, but gone from his seat. The driver called his name for the final stop. There was no answer. The other passengers, gathering their coats, began to look around. The seat where Tedford had been sleeping was empty. His belongings were not. His suitcase was still in a luggage rack. A bus timetable lay on the empty seat. James Tedford himself had vanished. The 14 other passengers were stunned. They had not seen him leave. They had heard no disturbance, no cry, no scuffle. The driver was certain no one had gotten off. The police were called. They were baffled. They searched the bus. They questioned every passenger. No one had an answer. He was there, and then he was not. He had vanished from a moving vehicle surrounded by witnesses while traveling through the very heart of the Bennington Triangle. This was not a lonely mountain trail. This was not a case of a hiker underestimating the wilderness. The rules of logic were completely inverted. James Tedford was a 68-year-old veteran. He was a resident of the Bennington Soldiers' Home, a man simply trying to get back to his bed. The bus was, by all accounts, a sealed container. The driver was adamant no one got off. The passengers were adamant no one got on and no one left. The windows were closed. He could not have jumped. The bus was moving at high speed through the freezing Vermont night. To open a window or door would have been a loud, violent, and obvious event. The police investigation was a farce from the start. What could they investigate? There was no crime scene. The bus itself was the crime scene, but it offered no clues. There were no signs of a struggle. There was no broken window. There was no blood. Tedford's belongings were still on the rack, untouched. His wallet was still inside his suitcase. This was not a robbery. This was not an abduction. This was a human being, present one moment and absent the next. The authorities were paralyzed. They questioned the driver. They questioned all 14 passengers, one by one. Their stories were all the same. He was there, he was quiet, and then he was gone. The police had no choice but to let the bus and its passengers go. They were left holding an empty suitcase and a bus timetable, the only remaining proof that James Tedford had ever existed. The case was a paradox. It was a locked room mystery, but the room itself had been moving through the very center of the dark territory that had claimed Middie Rivers and Paula Welden. The case was so bizarre, so impossible, that it barely made the news. It was treated as a strange anecdote, a baffling but minor event. There was no massive search, no media frenzy. How could there be? Where would they even begin to look? You cannot search a mountain for a man who disappears from a moving bus. There was no trail to follow, no red parka to look for. There was only an empty seat. The investigation, with nowhere to go, turned to Tedford's past. They found he was a World War I veteran, not a World War II veteran as some reports claimed. He was a quiet man, known at the soldiers' home. But his life was marked by a dark, chilling precursor. Years earlier, James Tedford's own wife had also disappeared. She, too, had vanished without a trace, leaving him behind. And now, he'd followed her into the same unexplained void. The coincidence was grotesque. It was another layer of impossibility, a detail that only deepened the shadows. Tedford's family had no answers. He had been despondent about returning to Bennington, but not suicidal. The case of James Tedford was an escalation. It was a new, more terrifying chapter in the Triangle's history. Middie Rivers and Paula Welden had walked into the wilderness. They had, in some way, crossed a physical line, leaving the world of man for the world of the trees. Their disappearances were chilling, but they followed a kind of dark, ancient logic. Do not go into the woods. But James Tedford had not gone into the woods. He was merely passing through, insulated from the dark by steel and glass. He was a passenger, a passive observer, and yet the void had reached him. This changed everything. The rules were different now. The police were no longer just dealing with a cursed piece of land. They were dealing with something that could bypass locked doors. The investigation went nowhere. It was perhaps the shortest investigation in Vermont's history. There was nothing to investigate. The 14 passengers were questioned and released. The driver was questioned and released. The bus was inspected for clues and returned to service, its empty seat a silent, rolling enigma. The case was filed away, a logical absurdity. How could it be otherwise? What theory could they possibly pursue? Had he been murdered on the bus? 14 witnesses heard nothing, saw nothing. A struggle, a cry, a moment of violence, all of it would have been noticed. The bus was a small, quiet, enclosed space. Had he leapt from the bus? It was a cold, dark December night. The bus was moving at speed. A jump would have been suicide, but a suicide that required him to somehow open a sealed window or door without alerting anyone. No one heard the rush of cold air. No one saw an open door. The only remaining truth was the one that logic could not accept. That James Tedford had dematerialized. He had been erased from his seat. The dark territory of Glastonbury Mountain was no longer just a passive wilderness that swallowed hikers. It was an active phenomenon. It was a predator. It had shown that it did not need you to walk onto its trails. It could reach out onto the highway. It could come inside. And what of his wife? The woman who had also vanished years before? Was it a simple, tragic coincidence? Or was the Tedford family somehow marked? Was this a curse that had followed him, waiting for him to pass through the one small patch of land where such things were possible? The questions were not for police. They were for priests, for madmen. The disappearance of James Tedford solidified the legend. It was no longer just a hiker's problem. The road itself, Route 9, was now seen as part of the Triangle. The Bennington Triangle had proven it could take an expert. It had proven it could take a novice. Now, it had taken a passenger. The scope of its power was growing. The police were left with a report that read like fiction. A man vanished from a sealed bus. The file was closed almost as soon as it was opened. What else could be done? They could not drag the highway. They could not send search parties into the air. The other 14 passengers returned to their lives, forever marked as witnesses to an event that defied reality. Their statements were useless because what they described could not have happened. They were not unreliable. They were a collective. They were sober, Ordinary people who all agreed on two impossible facts. James Tedford was on the bus, and James Tedford did not get off the bus. Their unified testimony made the event more terrifying. It eliminated any hope of a simple, rational mistake. This is the true horror of the Tedford case. With Middie Rivers and Paula Welden, there was at least a process. There were searches. There were dogs. There were theories of lost hikers or serial killers. There was a physical space. The mountain, to blame, to search, to fear. There was the false hope of finding a body, a scrap of red fabric. But James Tedford offered no such comfort. His disappearance was clean, sterile, and absolute. He was not lost. He was deleted. Void had become mobile. This event cemented the Bennington Triangle as a place of pure, active malice. The legend was now complete. The land was not just unlucky. It was a predator. The bus was a symbol of civilization, a small, warm piece of the town moving through the dark, and the dark had reached inside. The residents of the Bennington soldiers' home where Tedford lived were terrified. Many were veterans, men who had seen the horrors of war. But this was a different kind of enemy, one that followed no rules. The highway Route 9 was no longer a safe passage. It was a gauntlet. The mountain, it seemed, no longer waited for you to come to it. The dark territory was no longer just the mountain. It was the road. It was the very air through which the bus passed. The Bennington Triangle was a geographical area, but its influence was now proving to be something else, something that could ignore physical barriers. The bus was sealed, but it was not safe. The case also marks a critical turning point in the timeline. The 3-year silence between Paula Welden's vanishing and James Tedford's was now broken. It was as if the mountain had been dormant, waiting. Now, it was awake, and it was accelerating. The disappearance of James Tedford was not an isolated event. It was the opening act of a new, rapid cluster. The year 1949 was ending. 1950 was about to begin, and it would be the darkest, most terrifying year in the Triangle's history. The mountain, having proven it could take an expert, a novice, and a passenger, would now turn its attention to the most vulnerable victim imaginable. The case of James Tedford was not just a cold case. It was a non-case. It was a logical impossibility. A report filed away in a drawer labeled Unsolvable. His luggage, left on the overhead rack, was eventually turned over to his family. A final, hollow collection of his last moment. His relatives, the ones who had just seen him off, were left with an answer that made no sense. He did not arrive. He did not get lost. He simply stopped. There was no body to bury, no funeral to hold. It was a clean, brutal subtraction from the world. The bus itself, a rolling crime scene with no crime, went back into service, its route unchanged, its seats filled with new passengers, all of them unknowingly passing through the same invisible, hungry space. This disappearance was a profound violation of known physics. It was the ultimate anti-forensics story. In the Middie Rivers and Paula Welden cases, one could at least invent a rational theory. A hidden killer, a sudden fall, an animal attack. The wilderness was vast. It could hide a secret. But the bus was not vast. It was a small, illuminated, populated box. The 14 passengers and driver were not collaborators. They were terrified witnesses who saw nothing. This made their testimony all the more chilling. There was no what if. There was only what happened. The case provided no room for doubt, and therefore, no room for comfort. It suggested that dark territory was not a physical location, but a phenomenon that could intersect with our world at will, passing through steel and glass as if they were not there. The highway was no longer a shield. It was just a path that led through the monster's hunting ground. The disappearance of James Tedford on December 1, 1949, was the moment the Bennington Triangle escalated. The 3-year quiet period was over. The anomaly was back, and it was more aggressive, more baffling, and more terrifying than before. The mountain had shown its hand. It had taken the 74-year-old expert, Middie Rivers, proving experience was no defense. It had taken the 18-year-old novice, Paula Welden, proving youth was no protection. Now it had taken the 68-year-old passenger, James Tedford, proving that civilization was no shield. The pattern was one of escalation. The fear in Bennington was no longer just about the long trail. It was about the town. It was about the roads. The silence of the mountain was over. The year 1950 was about to begin, and the void was not just awake, it was hungry. The void did not wait long. The year 1950 would prove to be the most terrible and aggressive period in the history of the Bennington Triangle. The disappearance of James Tedford had proven that the highways were not safe, that the dark territory was not confined to the woods. The fear was no longer about a choice to go hiking. It was about an active, unseen predator that could bypass steel and glass. Less than a year later, on October 12, 1950, the mountain escalated its pattern. It had taken an expert, a novice, and a passenger. Now, it would prove that no one was safe. It would come for a child. His name was Paula Jean. He was 8 years old. The scene of the vanishing was not a remote trail. It was not the deep, silent woods of the Long Trail. It was his own family's farm, a place of supposed grubby safety. The farm was located on the edge of the Bennington town dump, a desolate, open scar on the land. It was a place of waste, of cold winds and of scavenging animals. Paul's father, Theodore Jepson, was a caretaker. He was driving his pickup truck, with Paul sitting beside him in the cab. It was a normal, routine afternoon. The father pulled the truck to a stop to go feed the family's pigs. A simple, daily chore. He left his son, Paul, waiting in the truck. The cab was a small, safe, metal box. The father was only a few dozen yards away, well within shouting distance, in plain sight. He was gone for only a few moments, his back turned as he tended to the animals. The entire event, from start to finish, could not have lasted more than a minute. When Theodore Jepson turned back to the truck, his son was gone. The truck was empty. The door was open. The 8-year-old boy had vanished. The father called his name. Paul! The only reply was the sound of the wind, cold and indifferent, blowing across the desolate fields of the dump. The panic was immediate, a cold, sharp blade. He searched the immediate area, his calls growing more frantic, echoing over the piles of refuse. But Paul was gone. He was wearing a bright red jacket. The detail was a chilling, grotesque echo of the Paula Welden case. It was a mockery. A bright, unmissable splash of color, just like the red parka. In this gray, desolate landscape, a boy in a red jacket should have been visible for hundreds of yards. He should have been impossible to lose, impossible to miss. But like the parka, the jacket was gone, as if the color itself had been erased from the world. The authorities were called immediately. But this time, the response was different. This was not the chaotic, uncoordinated failure of 1946. This was the newly formed Vermont State Police, the very organization created because of Paula Welden's disappearance. They arrived organized, professional, and determined. This would not be a repeat. They brought in a small army of volunteers. They brought the bloodhounds. They were confident that this time, they would find the trail. They would find the boy. The system was now in place. But they were about to learn that the system made no difference. The void was not afraid of a uniform. The hounds were about to fail. Just as they had before, But this time, the failure would be even more profound and even more terrifying. The search for Paul Jeppson began with a grim professional efficiency. This was the new Vermont State Police, an organization born from the failure to find Paula Welden. They were determined. This would not be a repeat of that chaos. They sealed the area. They fanned out in perfect, disciplined grid patterns. The entire town dump, every pile of refuse, every ditch was meticulously searched. Volunteers came in, hundreds of them, a small, somber army combing the nearby woods and fields. But the bright red jacket was nowhere. It had vanished from the open air, just yards from his father. The focus, then, fell on the bloodhounds. This was the critical test. The dogs were brought to the pickup truck, the last place Paul was known to be. They were given his scent from an article of his clothing. The handlers unleashed them. The dogs immediately picked up a trail. It was strong. They barked, and for a moment, the searchers felt a cold, professional certainty. They were on the path. But the path the dogs followed was wrong. It was horrifyingly, illogically wrong. The scent did not lead toward the pigsty where his father was. It did not lead back to the farmhouse. The trail led away from the truck, straight past the dump, and onto a local quiet road. It was the scent of an 8-year-old boy, walking alone, away from his father toward the wilderness. The police followed, their hopes sinking with every step. Why was he walking on the road? The hounds pulled, following the invisible trail for several hundred yards. Then, at a specific unmarked spot in the middle of the empty road, the dogs stopped. They stopped dead. They whined, sniffing the gravel, the empty air, and circled in total, abject confusion. The trail was gone. It had not turned off into the woods. It had not faded. It had been severed. It had been cut cleanly, as if Paul Jeppson had been lifted straight into the sky from the middle of the road. It was the exact same phenomenon that had stopped the hounds on the long trail. It was the severed scent of Middie Rivers. The state police, with all their new procedures and new uniforms, were stopped dead by the same impossible dark signature. The void had struck again, and it had left the same maddening anti-forensic clue. The searchers were left standing on an empty road, staring at a mystery that had no answer. The mountain was mocking them. It had taken a child, and it had used the same impossible magic to cover its tracks. The grim reality settled in. All their organization, all their training, meant nothing. They were just as lost as the searchers in 1946. The severed trail on the empty road was a devastating, impossible clue. The searchers were now standing in the exact same footprints of failure as the 1946 search party. The new state police, with all their training, had been defeated by the same phenomenon. The void had left its signature. The organized, professional search had slammed into a wall of pure impossibility. There was nowhere left for the dogs to go. The trail did not exist. This single maddening fact forced the investigation into its only rational corner. If a person's scent is severed on a road, it means they got into a vehicle. Paul Jeppson, they concluded, must have been abducted. This was the only theory that human logic would allow. A stranger must have been waiting, pulled up, grabbed the boy from the truck, and driven off. This theory at least kept the monster human. It was a dark comfort, but it was a comfort that the facts would not allow. The father, Theodore Jeppson, was only yards away. He was adamant. He had seen nothing. He heard no car approaching on the quiet gravel road. He heard no car door open or slam. He heard no cry from his son. He heard no sound of a struggle. The truck itself told no story. The cabin was a tiny enclosed space. It should have held evidence of a violent struggle, of a small boy being forcibly removed. But there was none. There were no foreign fingerprints, no torn fabric, no blood. The boy was just gone. For the abduction theory to be true, the kidnapper would have to have been a ghost. They would have needed to be completely silent, instantaneous, and invisible, snatching a child from under his father's watch in the span of less than a minute. It was a perfect, impossible crime. The search, deprived of a trail, now grew frantic. It turned away from the road and back to the farm and the dump, searching in desperate, repeating circles. Volunteers, now numbering in the hundreds, formed human chains and swept the woods. They were searching for a small boy in a bright red jacket. He should have been a beacon in the gray October landscape. The media descended, and the story became a national horror. An 8-year-old snatched from his father's truck in broad daylight. The red jacket became a symbol, a chilling, grotesque echo of Paula Welden's red parka. The cases were now inextricably linked in the public's mind. The press began to speak of a curse. The police were left with no leads, no suspects, and no body. The case had hit a wall. The void had taken a child, leaving behind only an open truck door and a scent trail that led to nowhere. The Bennington Triangle was no longer just a local legend. It was a proven, active predator, and it had just taken its most vulnerable victim of all. The investigation was now paralyzed. Both logical paths, that he walked away or that he was taken, led to an impossible conclusion. The search had nowhere to go. It devolved into a grim, hopeless routine. The professional, organized search of the Vermont State Police dissolved into the same dark desperation as the one for Paula Welden. The men were no longer searching for Paul. They were searching for anything, a single scrap of evidence to prove he was ever really there. The red jacket was gone. This failure had a profound, chilling effect on the searchers. They were combing the same ground, over and over, finding nothing. The dump was a bleak, windswept place, and the nearby woods felt watchful, silent. The failure was absolute. It wasn't just that they couldn't find him. It was as if he had been unmade. Theodore Jepson was at the center of this impossibility. He was the only witness to a non-event. He had to relive that 1 minute, his back turned, over and over for investigators. They were sympathetic, but they had to press him. "Are you sure you heard nothing? Are you sure you saw no car?" His certainty that nothing had happened was, in itself, the most terrifying fact. He was a man who had to watch his son be erased by a moment of silence. The police, in their desperation, were asking a man who saw nothing to produce a clue. They were trying to find forensics in a vacuum. With no logical suspect, the locals fell back on the old fears. This wasn't a kidnapping. This was the mountain. This was the curses the media was now openly discussing. A human predator, a kidnapper, would have been rushed. They would have left a sign, a footprint, a tire track, a sign of struggle in the truck. This was different. This was clean. This was the mountain signature. The bright red jacket was not just a tragic detail. It was a grotesque mockery of the Paula Welden case, as if the void was taunting them, proving that even a bright beacon of color was meaningless against its power. The questions were maddening, and they offered no answers. The search was eventually, quietly, called off. The snows of 1950 began to fall, burying the farm, the dump, and the empty road. The Vermont State Police, in their first major test against the void, had failed. They had been defeated by the same impossible signature that had baffled the old sheriff. The mountain had proven, once again, that human systems, human logic, and human determination were meaningless. The case went cold, a file of pure, unanswered terror. Paul Jepson was gone, but the mountain, in this dark, accelerated year, was not yet finished. The case of Paul Jepson went cold almost immediately. It was a wound in the community, a new, raw terror that eclipsed what had come before. The disappearance of a child from his father's truck. in broad daylight, was an act of profound, aggressive malice. The failure of the new Vermont State Police was a devastating blow. Their professionalism, their search grids, their bloodhounds, none of it mattered. They had been defeated by the same impossible signature, the same severed scent trail that had marked the other cases. The void had simply ignored them, proving their authority was a fiction. The pattern was now undeniable, and it was terrifying. In 1945, the Triangle had taken an expert, Middie Rivers, proving the woods were not safe for those who knew them. In 1946, it had taken a novice, Paula Welden, proving they were not safe for the innocent. In 1949, it had taken a passenger, James Tedford, proving that civilization, the steel and glass of a bus, was no shield. And now, just 10 months later, it had taken a child, Paul Jeppson, proving that even a father's watch, a distance of mere yards, was no protection. The escalation was complete. No one was safe. The fear in Bennington was no longer a quiet whisper. It was a suffocating, open dread. Parents did not let their children play outside. The Bennington Triangle was now a household name, a byword for a hungry, cursed land. The red motif, the red parka, and the red jacket was a sickening, grotesque coincidence. It was a taunt, a bright beacon of color that, in both cases, had been completely erased from the world, swallowed by the gray, oppressive landscape. It was a message. I can take anyone, anything, even the thing you think is most visible. The police had no answers. They had no suspects. They had no leads. They had nothing. The file on Paul Jeppson joined the others, a collection of impossible contradictions. How does a boy vanish from a truck in broad daylight without a sound? How does his scent trail lead to the middle of a road and simply stop? The year 1950 had been a brutal, rapid succession of horrors, proving the 3-year quiet period was not an end, but a pause. The dark territory was now fully awake, and it was on a timetable. The vanishing of Paul Jeppson was the fourth in the cluster. It was the most heartbreaking, but it was not the last. The mountain had one more victim to take. The cluster of 1945 to 1950, a 5-year window of terror, was about to close with its final, and perhaps its most baffling mystery of all. The disappearance of Paul Jeppson on October 12, 1950, had plunged the Bennington area into a state of active terror. The void was accelerating. What had begun as a string of disappearances separated by years was now a rapid, aggressive cluster. The mountain was awake, and it was hunting. The police were helpless. The community was terrified. And they did not have to wait long. Just 16 days later, the dark territory would claim its 5th and final victim. The date was October 28, 1950. The victim was Frida Langer, a 53-year-old woman from Massachusetts. She and her husband, Max, were on a camping trip, staying in a tent near the Somerset Reservoir. This was not the deep, cursed woods of Glastonbury Mountain itself, but it was adjacent, part of the same vast, dark wilderness. Frida was an experienced hiker and woodswoman. She knew the area. She was not a novice. She understood the woods. She respected the cold. On that cold, damp afternoon, Frida and her cousin, Herbert Elsner, decided to go for a short hike. The air was frigid, the ground was wet, and the sky was a low, gray, oppressive ceiling. This was not a hike for pleasure. It was a hike against the coming dusk. They were walking along a familiar, easy trail. After about a mile, Frida slipped while crossing a small stream. Her clothes were soaked, and the cold air was sharp. She was uncomfortable, but not in any danger. She told Herbert that she was going to go back to the campsite, just a mile away, to change her wet clothes. She told him to wait for her, and she would be right back, and they could continue their walk. It was a simple, logical decision. The path was clear. The camp was close. Herbert waited. He saw her walk back down the trail, a familiar, confident figure, disappearing around a bend. He waited, but she did not return. After half an hour, his patience turned to a cold, familiar dread. This was not a normal delay. He walked back to the campsite. The tent was empty. Her husband, Max, had not seen her. Frida Langer, an experienced hiker on a trail she knew, just a mile from her camp, had vanished. She had not returned to the tent. She had not returned to the trail. She had been erased from the short 1-mile path between the stream and the campsite. The alarm was raised immediately. This time there was no confusion, no disbelief. The Vermont State Police, already on high alert from the Jepson case, descended on the reservoir with a grim, chilling speed. They knew exactly what this was. The mountain was not finished. The fifth vanishing had begun. This time, the search was massive, immediate, and desperate. They knew they were not just racing against the cold. They were racing against the void. This was the largest, most desperate search yet. The Vermont State Police, the National Guard, and hundreds of local volunteers swarmed the Somerset Reservoir. The authorities were not just searching for a lost woman. They were trying to stop a monster, to catch the void in the act. This was the second disappearance in just 16 days. The fear was no longer a cold dread. It was a white-hot panic. The search was a military operation. Planes were brought in, flying low over the dense, dark canopy of the Green Mountain National Forest. Ground crews, equipped with radios, formed tight, overlapping search patterns. They were determined. They would not be beaten this time. But the mountain was a brutal, indifferent enemy. The conditions were horrific. The weather was cold, and the ground was a wet, freezing sponge. The searchers were soaked, their hands numb. Every hour, the temperature dropped. Winter was not just coming. It was here. The men were not just fighting a mystery. They were fighting hypothermia. They were fighting the terrain. And they were fighting the failing light. And then the bloodhounds were brought in. This was the moment of truth. The dogs were given Frida's scent from her belongings at the tent. They were taken to the small stream where she had slipped. They found her trail instantly, barking with confidence. They followed her scent back from the stream, along the exact path her cousin had watched her take. The handlers followed, their hopes rising. This was it. The trail was strong. The dogs followed the path for half a mile. And then, in the middle of an open clearing, on a bed of wet leaves and pine needles, the dogs stopped. They did not just lose the trail. They did not circle in confusion. They stopped dead, as if a wall had been slammed down in front of them. They whined. They backed away. They refused to go further. It was the signature. It was the same. Impossible, supernatural severing of a trail that had defeated them with Middie Rivers, with Paula Welden, with Paul Jepson. The void had left its mark, and it was the same. Every single time. The searchers were left standing in an empty clearing, defeated. The most advanced, organized search in Vermont's history had been stopped cold by the same phenomena. The trail was gone. Frida Langer, like the others, had been lifted off the earth. The search was over before it had even truly begun. The police, the soldiers, the pilots, they were all just men, walking in circles, looking for a ghost who had left no tracks. The mountain had taken its final victim, and it had done so with a terrifying, arrogant familiarity. The severed trail was the final word. The massive, military-style search for Frida Langer was a complete and total failure. The planes saw nothing. The hundreds of men on the ground, combing the cold, wet forest, found nothing. The dogs were useless. The void had struck for the 5th time, and for the 5th time, it had left no clues, no trail, and no victim. The search continued for weeks, a grim, hopeless ritual. But the weather was turning. The deep, heavy snows of 1950 began to fall, burying the reservoir, burying the trails, and burying any hope of finding her. The search was, once again, officially called off. The final victim of the cluster was gone. The Bennington Triangle had closed its 5-year window of terror with its most rapid and arrogant display of power, taking 2 people in 16 days. Frida Langer's file joined the others: Rivers, Welden, Tedford, Jepson. A collection of impossible, unexplainable, anti-forensic events. The mountain was silent again, and the case went cold. But this time, the story did not end there. This time, the void would make a mistake. Or perhaps it was a final, chilling statement. For 6 months, the snows covered the land. The case was cold. The mystery frozen. Then, on May 12th, 1951, as the spring thaw melted the ice, her body was found. A group of hikers, navigating the overgrown wet land near the reservoir, stumbled upon her remains. She was found in a clearing, in a tangle of deep brush. The discovery sent a shockwave through the state. They had finally found one. They had a body. They had a crime scene. The void had finally left evidence. But the hope for answers died the moment the police arrived. The body of Frida Langer did not solve the mystery. It made it infinitely deeper. First, there was the location. She was found in an area that had not just been searched but had been meticulously combed by hundreds of men and dogs during the initial hunt. Searchers had walked directly over that spot, or within feet of it, dozens of times. Yet in October, she was not there. In May, she was. It was an impossibility. Had the body been moved? Or had it been returned? Second, there was the cause of death. Her body was badly decomposed by the harsh winter, but the medical examiner, despite a thorough autopsy, could find no cause of death. There were no bullet holes. There were no broken bones. There was no sign of a struggle, no sign of violence, no trace of poison. The official cause of death was listed as undetermined. Frida Langer was the only victim ever found, and her discovery told them nothing. It was the final, silent, arrogant taunt from the dark territory. It was a body without a story, an answer that was just a deeper, colder question. The 5-year window was closed. From 1945 to 1950, something hunted the land around Glastonbury Mountain. And then, as abruptly as it began, it stopped. The cluster ended, leaving behind 5 permanent, unhealable wounds, and a silence more terrifying than the events themselves. The cases were not just unsolved. They were, by their very nature, unsolvable. They were a perfect, 5-part demonstration of an anti-forensic void. This was not a random series of tragedies. It was a pattern. It was an escalation. The dark territory was testing its boundaries. First, it proved that experience was useless by taking Middie Rivers, the 74-year-old expert who knew the land better than any man alive. Second, it proved that public effort was useless by taking Paula Welden. Her case, the red parka, sparked a massive search and a media frenzy. It created the Vermont State Police. And all of that human effort produced nothing. It was a total, humiliating failure. Third, it proved that logic was useless by taking James Tedford. He was not in the woods. He was on a bus, surrounded by witnesses, in a sealed, locked room. His vanishing proved the void was not bound by our physical rules. It could reach through steel. Fourth, it proved that protection was useless by taking Paul Jepson, an 8-year-old boy watched by his father, vanished in a single minute of silence. He was not lost. He was taken, silently, from just yards away. And finally, it proved that evidence was useless by taking Frida Langer. She was the only victim returned. But her body, found in a place that had already been searched, told no story. The cause of death was undetermined. The one piece of evidence we have is just a deeper, colder question. This is the legacy of the Bennington Triangle. It is not just a collection of cold cases. It is a single, coherent narrative of a power that defies every tool we have. Logic, forensics, manpower, and technology. The only piece of evidence that links them all is the one that makes no sense. The severed scent trail. The recurring, impossible moment where the bloodhound stopped dead, sniffing the empty air, defeated by a trail that had been cleanly and supernaturally cut. So what was it? What stalked this small patch of Vermont? The human mind demands a human answer. We look for a person, a motive, a serial killer who used the deep woods as a perfect cloak. This theory, at least, is comforting. It keeps the monster in a form we can understand. But this theory, the only one that offers any comfort, is the one that requires the most belief. It asks us to believe in a phantom. A killer who could take an expert guide in front of his party without a sound. A killer who could somehow board a moving bus, abduct a man, and leave all without 14 other passengers seeing or hearing a thing. A killer who could snatch an 8-year-old boy from a truck so silently that his father, yards away, suspected nothing. And most impossible of all, a killer who possessed a power that could erase the very scent of his victims from the earth, fooling the most highly trained hounds, not just once, but over and over again. This theory does not solve the mystery. It is the mystery. When all rational explanations are burned away, what is left? We are left with the land itself. We are left with the cursed mountain the native tribes warned of. The man-eating stone. The place where the four winds meet. A window that opens and closes at random, swallowing those unlucky enough to be standing in the wrong place at the wrong time. This is not an explanation. It is just a description of the void. Today, Glastonbury Mountain is still a ghost town. The Bennington Triangle is just a name. But the land is real. The wilderness is still there. Dark, vast, and silent. The cases are not unsolved. They are unsolvable. They are our permanent, cold record of a place that, for 5 years, decided to hunt. The void is the only answer. It is the silence that met the hunter's calls. It is the empty air the dog sniffed. It is the vacant seat on the bus. It is the open door of the truck. And it is the undetermined, silent cause of death for the only victim who ever came back. We have not found the answer. We have only found the edge of the void and stared into it. These are the questions that define a dark territory. If you believe the most compelling stories are the ones hidden in plain sight, and you want to continue exploring these dark, unanswered voids with us, subscribe to Plain Sight Docs and hit the notification bell. You won't want to miss the evidence we're examining next.